Grüß, willkommen in einem aufregendes video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 7 of my organisation series. In this case I'll be providing a view of the US World War II divisions and how they changed in terms of combat strength during the war. For this analysis I'll be using the points system from the Corps Commander set of figure gaming rules. This point system is based largely on the physical attributes of the various weapon systems such as armour thickness, gun penetration rates, weight of fire, speed, special combat features and so on. If you wish to investigate this point system in more detail, feel free to view my videos on Corps Commander or download the rules or game aids. As we progress through the years that World War II spanned, many changes in terms of formations are not organisational but are related to equipment, better guns, better tanks and so on. As I'm using a point system which does discriminate between a 37mm anti-tank gun and a 57mm anti-tank gun, you will see these changes in the points shown. The equipment mix I'll be using is based on as much evidence as I can identify, but I have to admit a lot of it is gut feel. The organisations I'm using are mainly sourced from the Nearhorst TONEs. However, I did need to fill in a lot of gaps, so I've no doubt there may be minor errors. However, apart from this, I feel that it still gives me a generally accurate ballpark feel of how the divisions are in terms of strength and how they changed. For this analysis, the primary formation I'll focus on is the battalion. Companies will be included when they are support formations or when it's unavoidable to include them. A final point, viewers need to understand that 100 points of tanks will operate very differently from 100 points of infantry. Thus, comparing tank battalions with infantry battalions needs to be done through a subjective filter. However, comparing a tank battalion in 1942 with one in 1945 is valid, as is comparing a US tank battalion with a German Panzerwagen battalion. This video divides the US Army into stages dictated by the campaigns they fought in. Each formation's Corps Commander TONE will be displayed. There is no need to read this in any detail. The relevant data will be covered in a more simplistic manner in the following slide. The detail has been included so viewers can check if the TONE is reasonable. The values that you see here are all shown in terms of individual vehicles, guns and multiples of 10 men. Thus, if we look at an example, 3 by T13 means that there are 3 T13 tank destroyers in that formation. The points total are provided for each battalion, with support formations grouped into headquarters support formations. 3 points values are provided. In this case, the first is green, second is trained, and the final veteran. I'll be using the raw points value unaffected by morale, but this provides a view of what I feel the morale or quality range of the formation in question was in the period in question. This shows the simplified breakdown of the division, regiment and battalions. After the formation name there are 2 values. The first is the Corps Commander points value, with the second being that value divided by 250. The points value gives you an idea of the combat capability or effectiveness of the formation, with the second value provided for greater clarity. You need to note that while the figure gaming points provides a rough way of ensuring force mixes are balanced, they can never be perfect. If one formation or side is 1,000 points and the other is 1,001 points, this does not mean the latter will win any conflict. As a result, it's best to look at the value several orders of magnitude higher. Thus, dividing by 250 gives you a simpler value, where a value of 2 is clearly inferior to a value of 3 in almost all cases. As for how accurate the figure gaming points-based system is, I have no idea, but I use points for games and it seems to work, within a reasonable margin of error. If I was doing this from a historian's point of view, I would use a raw firepower value, or what weight of shot can a formation pump out in a set period of time. The mad minute was an old British musket concept which they continued to use right up until at least World War I, if not World War II. The US started using this concept during the Vietnam War, if not before as well. The raw firepower value, or mad minute value, gives us a good firepower value for what a formation can use, and we can use this to compare like formation. However, going down that path, the historian's path, takes a lot of effort and energy, and many figure gaming point systems actually do use the same idea, along with including other factors which does affect combat efficiency, such as armour, which is not normally a factor in the man-minute calculation, and also the movement ability of formations, etc., or even things like profile. So, love it or hate it, I'm using a figure gaming points-based system to get an idea of the combat effectiveness of a formation. The first campaign the US was involved in was in North Africa, with the first stage ranging from November 42 to February 43. The Infantry Division which landed in North Africa is listed here, along with supporting battalions. In most cases, an infantry division would have at least an anti-tank attached formation and an anti-aircraft attached battalion. I must point out the tank destroyer battalions were actually anti-tank battalions. The Americans just happened to call them tank destroyers. If you're interested in the equipment which made up a battalion, feel free to pause this video and study this chart. But if you're not that interested in that level of detail, then don't do it and move on. The US did have issues when they first met the Germans, mainly due to leadership. As a result, you can see by this chart, the quality was by default rated as poor in the army list. This shows the combat value by battalion. As the battalions are all very large, I'll not go to the effort of rounding up to regiments, which I would if the battalions were unusually small. For figure gamers, the values could be used for megablitz, which is a set of rules in terms of steps. But if you're a non-figure gamer, which I assume you probably will be into most case, just consider the value as an educated estimate of that formation's combat effectiveness. Just a quick note, the tank destroyer gun battalions were not armoured and consisted of anti-tank weapons mounted on light trucks. However, putting the correct symbol moves for the unit moves us into very lesser known symbols which may be hard to follow. So I'll use a more simpler logical symbol, which happens to be armoured tank destroyer, even though it was not armoured. The US employed rather large armoured battalions in terms of sizes, as you can see here. Let's now move on to the armoured division, which you can see the first armoured division here, which happens to be a heavy division. The division which landed in North Africa was what was called a heavy division, or the old org structure, which meant that it was organised into armoured and armoured infantry regiments. The tanks were the older M3 main battle tanks, so the combat effectiveness of the medium tank battalion was probably lower than it should have been, but the Americans decided to send their better tanks, the M4s, to Britain so they could defeat Rommel in Egypt, and as a result they had to keep the older tanks. I've divided the Tunisian campaign into two stages, the initial landing, which we've already covered, and the second stage of the North African campaign, which probably began about April 43 and ended in May 43, was the final reduction of the Axis position in Tunisia. The infantry divisions fared poorly when they first met the Germans in Tunisia. Part of this was troops facing combat for the first time, but I feel the main aspect or main reason was poor leadership. After the initial shock, the US quickly sorted themselves out, and the division in this period could be considered very good, that is the latter period of the Tunisian campaign. The only noticeable change was the increased strength of the anti-tank gun battalion. This was caused by the replacement of the 37mm anti-tank gun with a more effective 57mm anti-tank gun. Otherwise, the division was much the same as before. I'm uncertain if the armoured division suffered the same lack of quality or effectiveness as the infantry divisions did when they first met the Germans. I possibly expect they did, because I suspect the main issue was at divisional HQ command or even corps command. But I also suspect that once the US had learnt their lessons, they learned them very well, and this division performed very well up until the end of the Tunisian campaign. While we can see there were some changes to the structure of some formations, specifically the attached M6 GMC anti-tank destroyer battalions, and some equipment changes, it did not affect the combat capability of this division. It's also possible in the latter half the Americans had received more M4s, and if that was the case, then the medium tank battalions would have almost certainly gone up to 6 strength points, but I'm uncertain of this. After the Tunisian campaign, the next campaign the US was involved in was the invasion of Sicily, which raged between July 43 to August 43. This was then quickly followed by the Italian invasion, of which the first stage raged from September 43 to December 43. A number of minor changes were implemented for the invasion of Sicily in Italy, as well as upgrades in equipment. The first change was a reduction in the non-battalion divisional support formations. The engineer battalion was beefed up and its strength grew as a result. On the other hand, the infantry regimental support formation was stronger. I suspect assets were moved from the divisional level to the regimental level. The infantry battalion combat capability did drop, so I suspect some of their assets have been moved up to the regimental level as well. The US did implement a new light structure for their armoured divisions. In this structure, the regiments were replaced by 3 combat commands. This duplicated the ad hoc German Kampfgruppen system, and it worked very well indeed. The division which went to Italy was technically a heavy division, but when it was used in Italy, it was used as if it was a light division, although a rather large light division. For this analysis, I'm assuming the US armoured divisions have flipped over to the light structure, even though the Americans did maintain at least 2 divisions in the heavy structure until the end of the war. I'm going to focus on the light, and that's what I'm showing here. The armoured artillery battalions did lose support formation, and as a result it did lose some combat capability, but it did retain its original artillery capability. These battalions had an enormous amount of completely unnecessary equipment, I assume, for the defence of the artillery, and it was quickly realised there was no need for it. The armoured and armoured infantry battalion absorbed the regimental support assets, and as a result grew in strength. The US began to deploy self-propelled anti-aircraft guns about this time as well. The US did conduct at least 2 airdrop operations in the campaign, but never at a full divisional level. There were a number of errors made during the drops and lessons that had to be learned, which were learned very well. I suspect the Italian campaign was a critical learning exercise, so when the airdrops occurred over France, they did not experience these same problems. When we look at this, you may think the airborne troops were rather weak. This was expected considering the lack of heavier equipment. To make up for this, the troops themselves were of an incredibly high quality and motivation. The second stage of the Italian campaign ran from January 44 to June 1944. This was then followed by what I call the third stage of the Italian campaign, which takes us up to the end of 1944. This second stage, or this stage, occurs concurrently with the liberation of France, which I'll deal in the next set of slides. The divisions, as you would expect, did not change very much. The structure remained the same, basically until the end of the war. There were nonetheless some minor changes. The engineer battalion lost some combat capability. I'm uncertain what the reasoning was. I suspect some assets were being concentrated at corps level. The light artillery also lost some supporting assets, but it still retained its standard number of tubes, thus it was still as effective as an indirect fire weapon. The infantry battalions were getting much more support equipment, which resulted in their combat strength now growing. The anti-tank battalion was upgraded to the 3-inch anti-tank gun, but this had minimal impact on its combat effectiveness, at least according to the points, at least the rounded up points. You can see there is some difference if you look at the hyper-detailed points. The armoured division, that is the US armoured division used in Italy, operated as if it was a light division, even though it was originally structured as a heavy division. This shows the division as if it was organised as a light division. The armoured engineers were again beefed up. The armoured division were equipped with self-propelled howitzers, which increased their combat strength because the vehicles were now armoured, but the number of tubes remained the same, so it still had much the same indirect fire capability. The armoured battalions were beginning to receive 3-inch armed M4M medium tanks, but at this scale the impact was minimal, so you won't see much difference in strengths. In theory, the airborne divisions could have been used in Italy, but this did not occur as they were all required for France, which is where they eventually all moved up to. There were some changes which occurred after the airdrops in Sicily and Salerno. The combined anti-aircraft, anti-tank battalion was beefed up, as were the glider support formations. I suspect this was a result of the paratrooper drops around Salerno, or a realisation the division needed more heavy weapons in order to be able to survive for any period of time after being dropped. We now come to the next stage, which is the invasion of France. This can be divided into two stages, the first starting in June 1944 and ending in August 1944. This was then followed by what I call the second stage, which was the breakout and pursuit of the German forces in France. This also included the invasion of southern France. This started at the end of August and ended roughly in November 1944. The infantry divisions which were involved in the invasion of France differed very little from the divisions which fought in Italy. There was no combat strength changes compared with the divisions which fought in Italy, even though some new equipment was being received by these divisions. As for the armour changes, no major changes occurred. The 3-inch armed M4s were beginning to arrive, but not in large numbers in June 1944. I'm not sure how many were actually used in June 1944. I suspect very few. As with the infantry divisions, no changes in combat strength occurred with the armoured divisions as compared with those that were being employed in Italy. Although, just a quick note, most of the armoured divisions used in France were light. There were nonetheless 2 heavies that were also used. The airborne divisions were most certainly used in June, and the largest airborne operations occurred during this period. After the minor reorganisations, after the early parts of the Italian campaigns, there were no changes in combat strength. This was the divisions which were used at D-Day and also at the Arnhem drops. The next stage is a rather unusual stage. This was the German counterattack and its final defeat, and lasted from between December 1944 and ending in February 1945. Once we move into 1945, I've combined both the Italian and German campaigns, and I could basically call it the European campaign. So while the Germans were being forced back in the Ardennes, the Italian campaign entered its final stage, ending in May 1945. Up around Germany, after the German counterattack at Ardennes had been defeated, the Western Allies launched Operation Plunder, which took the Allies all the way into the western part of Germany, ending the war in May 1945. Possibly the biggest change in the US infantry divisions in this period was in terms of experience and quality. By January 1945, most divisions could be easily considered as veterans. While there was no actual organisational changes, the 3-inch anti-tank battalions were receiving new ammunition in increased numbers, and this increased its combat effectiveness. This was, of course, the HVAP rounds. The tank battalions were beginning to mainly be equipped with 3-inch M4 medium tanks, also using these new rounds, which also increased their combat effectiveness. One benefit of using a point system is factors such as new ammunition is reflected in terms of combat factors, or points at least. The biggest change in the armoured division was equipment. The armoured divisions were beginning to receive the M24 light tanks and the M36 GMCs. The introduction of the new M24 increased proportion of 3-inch armed M4 medium tanks, and the improved ammunition boosted the tank battalion strengths dramatically. These formations were formidable indeed. The tank destroyers also received a boost with the introduction of the new M36 GMC. In 1945, the airborne divisions were significantly beefed up so they could now be deployed in the front line. The engineers and glider infantry all received new equipment. I can't but feel this was a misuse of these formations, but I suppose by March 1945 there was little opportunity of using them in their intended role. The main change in the paratroop or airborne divisions were the divisional support received additional equipment, as did the infantry, both paratrooper and glider troops. The 105mm pack howitzers were also being deployed about this time. Well, that's a breakdown of all the divisions based on the campaign. Now let's look at how the division changed over the length of the war. If we look at the changes to the infantry division, we can see this formation remained rather stable for the entire war. The biggest changes was in the often attached anti-tank battalions. When we look at the armoured divisions, we can see a major change when the divisions were restructured into its light form. When this occurred, the armoured and armoured infantry battalions became much more powerful. Obviously, the regimental support will move down into the battalion level. It must be pointed out, 2 divisions did retain their heavy structure. Apart from this, the main changes was the increased effectiveness of the armoured engineers, the full adoption of self-propelled howitzers, and the introduction of superior tanks and ammunition in late 1944 and 45. The airborne divisions experienced the greatest change in 1945 when they were equipped with much more heavy equipment so they could operate in the line. The US Army was possibly one of the easiest major powers to perform this type of analysis on. I expect to follow up with the other combatants, and then we'll do a series on comparing the formations within each major period. Thus, I'll be able to both compare how formations had developed within an army and then compare that army with opposing formations. And so we come to an end of my part 7 of my video series on organisation, in this case analysing the US Army in World War II in terms of how their divisions' combat power changed with time. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.